Today I would like to show you the installation of a NIStune board, a Type 1 into a S13 CA18DET ECU, which is this beastie here, part number 36F05. First of all, here's our NIStune Type 1 board. For most people that will come pre-programmed, and you should have the part number of your ECU written on there. The board will come with a socket to solder into the ECU, piece of foam to hold it all together, and two cables which will be part of the installation. So I'll just put those aside for now. First step is to remove the covers. Top cover off. Bottom cover off. This ECU appears to be in quite good condition. Always pays to give them a good check when you pull the covers off. And to access our chip where we're going to fit the board, we need to remove this detonation detection board. Get that out of the way, and we can see our chip in there, which we'll be removing. To remove the conformal coating, easiest way is just with a simple brush and some acetone. So you need to work that in a little bit. Idea is to get all the coating off from around those legs on the top of the board so that we can suck the solder through. If you leave the coating on there, it makes it quite difficult to suck the solder through because the coating actually holds the solder in place. So just work that in a bit. Often on this side that I'm doing now, there's not as much coating, so you can get away with spending less time on that. And they do vary from ECU to ECU. Sometimes the coating is quite thick and you need to spend a bit more time. This one's not too bad. I think that's almost it for that side. I'll just flip them over. And similar deal on here. Work it in. We need access to these pads that I'm doing just there, so clean those up as well. It's definitely worth spending a little bit more time on this side of things. It makes the soldering job easier later on. So a bit more acetone, work it in. And then I normally just mop that up with a piece of absorbent paper. Maybe one last go, get that last bit out. That should just about do it. And then I like to put some flux on there. That helps with your desoldering. The flux will allow a faster heat bridge and a more effective heat bridge between your desoldering iron and each of the pins, making it quicker and easier. And quicker and easier is always good. Lovely. Something I've found that it can be of great benefit when desoldering the chip is to warm the whole area with the heat gun. Just use your normal heat gun that people use for stripping paint. Idea is to just warm it up to a decent temperature so that the components on the ECU don't get damaged. Flip him over, apply some heat from the other side. Just be a wee bit careful not to damage other components, so sort of minimise the heat from this side. Your average heat gun has the potential to do some real damage to an ECU, so just be careful, particularly on the other side. I'll just give it a little bit more on this side. That should just about do it. Now you should be able to just still touch it without burning your finger. Now to the main event, the desoldering. Make sure you clean your desoldering iron before you start. I always like to wipe mine on a damp sponge so it gets maximum heat transfer. Start on these 4 pads over here. They're always good to warm up on, and then away you go. Got to try and keep your the time you spend on each pad to a minimum. Now these ones here, what the manufacturer has done is bent them over to hold the chip in place while it's wave soldered, so you need to use a technique similar to that to just lift them up, and then they become the same as the others. Now it may look like I'm grinding my desoldering tip into these pads, but in fact what you're trying to do is almost have the tip hovering above the pad, so you're hardly even touching the pad, because if you apply the heat and you really grind into it, then you will damage the pad, so you need to be a little bit careful there. That noise you can hear is just the leg of the chip inside the desolderer. This one on the corner is your power pin. That will take a bit more heat, so as you can see I'm just leaving that sit on there for a couple of seconds. That should be suitable. The other ones are just signal pins, so you need to be a bit more careful with those. There's not so much copper going to those. On the power and the ground pins, you will find that because there's so much copper going to it, that you do need to dwell a little bit longer on them. Also, don't have a coffee just before you attempt to do your desoldering, because it makes you wobbly, especially when you're on camera. These are all more signal pins, so you can scoot along on those quite quickly. You can hear the solder sucking through nicely. You get to know your own desolderer and how it works after a while, and whether things are going well or otherwise. Now we have another one of these pins that are bent over by the manufacturer when they built it. So just apply a little bit of solder to get a heat bridge going, then up with it. This one's a ground pin, so I'll leave it a wee bit longer. Looking sharp. Now you go in with your pliers and just give each of these a little bit of a wriggle, just to break them away. Sometimes there's just a tiny little bit of solder where the pin is touching the barrel. You need to just give that a wriggle to break it away. If you haven't desoldered it properly, then no amount of wriggling will help. That should be okay. Flip him over again. And on this side, for the same reason, just give those a bit of a push with a small screwdriver just to break them away from the barrels. You don't want to go trying to lever the chip out when that is still hanging onto the barrels. You can hear them crunching. That's generally a good sign. Then I've got a little tool that I use to lift them out. This one's almost jumping out actually. Almost. And there we go. Chip is out. You can usually tell if you've done a good job or not. If you look at the legs of the chip, there should be no trace of these pads on. Sometimes if these pads come off on the legs, then you've damaged the ECU and you will need to have a look at repairing that before you go. But if you have a look at these pads here, you'll see everything's in order. Sometimes if you get too rough or you give it a hard time, that pad will come off and it will actually pull a piece of track off as well. We're trying to avoid that at any cost. So I like to use a piece of absorbent towel and the trusty acetone again. Just get in there and remove any remaining coating or soldering flux. Sometimes if there are big chunks of coating still left on there, they can be removed with the heat gun. The heat gun does soften that coating and then you can just push it off with a screwdriver. That looks perfect. Do the other side. Same again, you can see there's a fair bit of flux on here. That's my fault. Flux is good when you're soldering, but it's bad at all other times. And you can see all the pads there are quite intact. That's a good sign. Okay, now we put our socket in there. Just make sure you line up the end. That indicates the pin 1 end, and you can see that there'll be a little mark on this as well. Pays to line them up. Not the end of the world if you put it in backwards, but it's nice to have things around the right way. I like to put a piece of masking tape on there just to hold that in temporarily. And we also put our ribbon cable in there. Now these have pin 1 is indicated with the red on there. Now if you have a look in the installation manual for this particular ECU, it will tell you that pin 1 on this cable should go match up with pin 1 on these holes here. So just slide those into there, and once again I like to hold that in place temporarily with a piece of masking tape. Try to get those nice and vertical if you can. Flip him over again, and it's time for soldering. Okay, make sure your soldering iron is nice and clean, and then leap into it. Okay, first we'll do the that ribbon cable connection. You can see you don't have to stay on there for long. Onto the socket, just do the 2 corner ones just to hold the thing in place while you solder the other pins. And then you can just work your way along. As per usual, I use quite a large chisel tip on my soldering iron. Idea being to get the heat in there fast and move along. You want to put just enough heat on there to let the solder wick through to the other side, but don't stay on there too long because those sockets are made of plastic. These 2 on the end here, they're grounds, so they'll take a bit more heat. This one here is a power pin. Once again, it'll take a bit more heat as well, so just leave the heat on for a sec so it gets through. And then onto the signal line, so these should be a bit faster. Don't push on the pin or the pad with the soldering iron, just rest it on there ever so gently. Once again, if you put too much heat on or you lean into it too much, you can move those pins in the socket and you don't want that, so get in, get the job done and move on. Okay, that's those done. Once again we go in with the cleaning now. So acetone, absorbent cloth and the brush. This is partly because we don't really want that sticky flux to stay on there. It gathers dirt and it is slightly corrosive. Not hugely corrosive, but it is still corrosive. But get rid of all of that, like so. And then everything's nice and clean, and we can have a good look at those with an eyeglass and make sure they're all soldered properly. Next step is the fitting of the USB port. The Type 1 ECUs do not run consult, so we can't tune them through the consult connector, so we fit our own USB port so you can plug straight into the ECU. Just move your detonation detection board out of the way, and you'll see this pot that used to be used for diagnostics. What we do is we get rid of that pot and we fit our USB port into the same position. You'll see there's a sticker on the outside there, so you have to peel that off and then remove these two screws. You can reuse these screws, or I would rather get rid of them personally. Put some slightly longer ones in. Either way, as long as you can secure your USB port in there, it's all good. So we get rid of those. Remove the port. We need to reuse the bracket, so idea is get rid of this pot off of here. That can go in the bin. Not required anymore because we have a better way of doing the diagnostics once we have a NIStune board in there. Bin. Okay, we just need that part there. Now, this hole that we're left with isn't quite big enough for our USB port, so we need to get a little bit brutal and drill that out. So just push your knock detection board out of the way temporarily, flip him over. I like to get it on the edge of the bench above the bin. We don't want swarf going through all of our good fun electronic gear. Out with the 3/8" drill bit and carefully now what you do have to be careful of is this swarf. You do not want that getting all through your ECU. So I like to get a blade and just deburr that hole. Same on the inside. Where would we be without Stanley knife blades? Okay, do that, and then use our absorbent cloth. Just tidy everything up. It's a good thing to be paranoid about the swarf. We need to get rid of that. Same on the other side, just check that everything's good. Maybe give them a bit of a bang, get rid of all the swarf. And then it's time to fit our USB port. Okay, here's our port, here's our bracket. Can be a wee bit fiddly. I like to use the USB cable that we use for our communications. Put that in there. That makes sure you get it in the right spot. These are my longer screws that I like to use. It's just M3 by, I think these are 16. Or you can reuse the original screws. Up to you. Another nice thing to do, especially if it's going to be if it's a track car, is I like to put just a drop of Loctite on those screws. Not really necessary, just another one of those nice things to have. Yeah. Alright, so we tighten those up. If you look in from directly above the connector, you'll see that it starts to bow out once you get it just tight enough. See those bowing out there? So you tighten the screws until they just bow out each side, and then you're about right. So then we have our USB port ready to roll. Alright, we're nearly there. We now have our USB port ready to roll. We have our IC socket in, and we have our connector for our ECU signal. So I'll just peel that tape off. Now on this particular ECU there are a couple of capacitors here which will get in the way. We don't have a lot of room, so we need to bend those over, carefully of course. This needs to come out that side, so I like to lay it down like that, and then it's time to fit our board. Here's our NIStune board. Just one thing to check whenever you're fitting these boards is there's a program jumper there. See how it says PGM on there? That is fitted when the board is programmed. It should be removed when the board is put into the ECU. So just check that that is open across there. It's a surface mount jumper, so it's quite small, but it is worth checking that that jumper has been removed, because the ECU will not run with that jumper in place. Okay, so now we just fit our board into the socket. You'll need to just take a look from the side, make sure they're all lined up nicely. You can see the pins in there. I'm not sure if that's going to come out on the video, but if you look inside here you can make sure that your pins are lined up. And then push down firmly but evenly on the board. It does take some force. Get him on there, and then it's a matter of connecting up. Your USB port goes onto the outside connector, and this one I actually like to get this ribbon cable and hook it underneath there when I put the detonation detection board back in. Something else that's nice to do is just put a little bit of RTV or some other sealant on that board just to hold it in place. Probably a blob there, and a little bit under here is generally a nice thing to do. Most of them don't need it. Like I said, that socket does fit quite firmly, so you don't really need the RTV, but especially if it's a track car or some sort of race car that's going to be used where there's a lot of vibration around, that will make sure the board stays in there. I've never actually seen one come loose, so call me paranoid if you will. Alright, now best way to get this ribbon cable in, put him around there, we plug that back in like so, and then that'll go back in just nicely. Everything will line up. So from there, really it's just a matter of reversing what we did to pull it apart. We bolt the knock detection board back in and put our lids back on, and we're there. You probably don't need to see me do that, so we'll call that done.